It was one mistake he never made, in fact. For if he had, he would not have survived so long. He saw and understood when the light of willing admiration shone in a woman's face. He knew for certain who would let him touch her and not betray him. Sometimes the look was innocent and uncertain, as Marile's had been, and sometimes it was direct, enticing, excited, as hers was. He was kept awake at night now, not by frustration, but by painful excitement and compulsive searching about in his imagination for an opportunity. As Commander-in-Chief of the Caraville Battalion, he was quartered in one of the principal bedchambers of the castle, in the same wing as Corral himself. Corral's suite of rooms was at the far end of the same corridor, within hailing distance, and as far as Jay knew, Dazil slept there too. So he was close to her at night. But the convenient proximity of the bedchambers also made his own room an impossible, dangerous meeting place. He knew of several possible venues outside the castle, such as an abandoned temple high on the North Plain, where he and the battalion camped overnight sometimes on long-range manoeuvres. But Dazil's ordinary routine was so bound by the confines of the castle that her going far beyond it would certainly be noticed by others. And it had begun to snow. During the day, he conducted his duties as energetically as usual. But every action and every conversation, every sight and every sound seemed transparent. Beyond them, he saw her dark eyes, touched the hot smoothness of her skin, tasted her mouth, and heard nothing. The heat of his thoughts was so intense that after dinner, especially if he saw her there, and she was always somehow nearby now, he would walk out into the snow just to cool his brow. He was careful to behave normally and not to give any outward signs of his preoccupied state. All the while, he watched for any chance to be alone with her. It was nearly 3 weeks before the feast of the Vanishing Sun. They had celebrated the archaic festival of the Feast of the Vanishing Sun on his homeworld too, but it was unknown on the warmer worlds of the Empire, where the length of day did not vary dramatically with the changing seasons. It was supposed to have originated in the days before Tazens first sailed the sea beyond the sky, in the now uninhabited northern lands of Tazar, where the sun shone feebly and coldly for only a few hours a day in the deepest part of winter, or did not rise at all for some months of the year. It was said that the feast had been taken by early sailors to these colder worlds, to alleviate the hardship and gloom of dark times. On Anhual, he recalled that it had been a festival full of spiritual significance and fervour. As kept by the sword-bearers of Caraville, it was an excuse to spend an entire night gorging on rich foods and drowning in fermented juice, until no one could stand upright or move if he could. The great hall of the castle was decked in gold, representing the hope that the sun would return, and tables had been moved in from the dining hall and piled with roasted animals, exotic fruits which were certainly not indigenous to Caraville, mounds of melth stuffed with berries, and wide bowls of steaming glin juice. A warlord's throne of honour, a huge stone seat covered with elaborate carvings, had been carried to the podium at one end of the hall, so that Corral could take his place in state and oversee his carousing henchmen. It was an extraordinary scene. Jay wondered how much the sword-bearer caste leaders knew about what went on out here, whether they were aware that General Corral was routinely addressed as "my lord" by his warriors, as if he were of the noble caste, that he presided over his army like a figure from a historical drama, even that fermented juice was freely available and openly drunk. He had developed a simple technique for avoiding glin juice, which involved accepting a full pitcher at the beginning of the evening, keeping it with him, and regularly raising it to his lips without actually drinking any. Corral, on the other hand, had clearly begun imbibing before the feast had properly started. When he stood up on the podium to open the festivities, he had a goblet in one hand and his face was flushed. Men, he said. Sword bearers. The hall fell silent. Every year at the Feast of the Vanishing Sun, we look back at the past. And we look forward to the future. Since I last stood here, since last year, Caraville has seen bad times and some good. Bad. Naril has gone beyond the mountains. Who would have thought at the feast last year when he stood at my right hand? Good. We have a new commander-in-chief, Javal. Javal, come here. Without enthusiasm, Jay joined Corral on the podium. He's only been here, 6 months? But in that time, he's turned you all around. I don't recognise the lacklustre, spineless bunch of near-priests you were last summer. A toast to Javal, finest chief I ever had. The company raised their tankards over their heads and cheered, but Jay found himself catching the eye of Sagat, who stood at the edge of the hall. He had lifted his cup only as far as his mouth, and his eyes were filled with a cold, speaking dislike. The intensity, the naked envy, surprised him. He had another moment of connection with this man, and for a few seconds, while everyone else in the hall shouted the name he had assumed, he tried to work out what it meant. He was not afraid that Sagat knew his secret, because there was no way that he could, and anyway, he would surely have denounced him already if he did. But his instincts were firing danger signals. You're popular, Commander. He broke off eye contact with Sagat and found that Dazil was almost pressing against his arm, having appeared closely behind him. Service is the only honour, my lady, he said, stepping back to make a formal bow and to get a clearer view of her. She had dressed for the feast in the most magnificent of traditional warrior queen's outfits, an elaborate, impenetrable shell of gleaming leather and metal, with boots that didn't end, and a cloak of swirling dark red fabric. Only her hands and her face were bare. Her fingernails were painted gold, her lips blood red. It was impossible and delicious to imagine that there was a soft body inside that carapace. Let the festival begin! Cried Corral, and there was uproar as the crowd surged towards the table of food. Javal, take Dazil down there and make sure she gets something to eat before that mob devours it all, he added, sinking back onto the throne and waving to the attendant servant for more glin juice. It was clearly his intention to preside warlord-like for a while longer. It will be an honour, sir. Jay held out his hand to her, and she took it, with a dark sideways glance. Jay did not return the look. It was not necessary. Almost no verbal communication was. He could feel the tension in her fingers as she pressed them into his hand. He could sense her excitement sharpened to a pitch of terror. As they approached the table, he deliberately let her hand drop away from his. Glin juice, he offered, dipping the ladle into the central bowl. She shook her head. I don't drink it. Well, don't tell the men, but nor do I. She smiled slightly. I know that. I've noticed before. It occurred to him that before that night was very far advanced, nearly everyone around them would be in an intoxicated stupor. It was good to have established between themselves that he and Dazil would not be. So what does Lord Corral think of your abstemious habits? He said. Knocking back glin juice seems to be an obligatory act of warriorhood here. As I said before, Lord Corral doesn't consider it appropriate for the Lady of Caraville to behave like a sword-bearer. You know, in other parts of the Empire, most sword-bearer wants a warlike wife. It's a mark of status if your wife can go several rounds with your clan rival. How about you, Commander? Is that the kind of wife you want? I'm quite content to remain unmarried for now, my lady, so I haven't got round to thinking about specifics. She had taken some of the stuffed mouth and was using the spoon to mash it flat. I honour all women, he added. The choice would be difficult. All women would return that honour, I'm sure. Choice is not always in our power. Choice is the strength of the heart. It's a priest caste saying. How do you know it? For one, on other worlds, the castes mix more freely together. And if I tell you something else in confidence, will you promise not to let the men know this either? Of course. My mother was a priest. Your mother? Quieter. Intermarriage isn't entirely uncommon on my homeworld. I realise it would be unthinkable here, so I've kept it to myself. No wonder, she said. But he could tell by her tone that she was impressed by this exotic information. And she gave him a glance, openly curious now, as if she were studying him to see if his mixed caste origins showed somehow. He smiled at her, deliberately, once, brilliantly. There was a clatter from the far end of the room, and the hubbub dipped as everyone looked in the direction of the podium. Corral had attempted to climb down from his throne, apparently to move towards the feasting tables, and had staggered and half fallen against one of the servants. With an inelegant movement, he lashed out at the man and struck him on the side of the face. The servant tottered and fell back under the force of the blow, but picked himself and Corral's goblet up uncomplainingly. Jay felt Dazil freeze at his side. With satisfaction, he helped himself to some melth. The feast went on late into the night, with new dishes and refilled bowls of lin juice brought to the tables in lengthy succession. When at last the servants began to clear the tables, Corral called for storytellers, and the men grouped in a loose gathering around the great fire. This was an element of sword-bearer culture which was crystallised into an art form in the civilised worlds, left to specialised performers with desirable qualities such as training and talent. On Caraville, the tradition could still be seen in the raw. The sword-bearers, most of them half incoherent with the effects of lin juice, would sit in a baying semicircle and nominate a volunteer to tell a story of some heroic deed attributable either to the narrator or another famous warrior. The resulting performances were predictably unedifying. Jay hung back as far as he could without appearing not to participate, searching with his senses rather than his eyes for Dazil, as Corral slapped forward one of the older and more garrulous of the warriors into the centre of the circle. After dinner, she had moved away from him rather deliberately. He spotted her out the corner of his eye, settled in one of the oversized wooden chairs near the fire, draped sideways over the arm with her chin in her hand. She was deep in the company, surrounded by others. There was no way at the moment that they could make contact with each other and slip out unnoticed, though the storytelling might have provided an opportunity. Impatiently, he looked around behind him and caught a flash of movement which registered somehow as important. He had not seen who it was who had flitted out of the back of the hall, but there was something about the motion itself that he recognised. With one more glance back at Dazil, who this time caught his eye briefly, he broke away from the ring of spectators and went to investigate. The back of the great hall was in darkness now, and snow was drifting against the huge black windows. He narrowed his eyes against the contrasting light, peering into the gloom. There was a scuffling sound, and then a slight moan. Hand on the hilt of his sword, he stepped swiftly into the corner and pulled aside one edge of the heavy wall drape. Paril raised his head from Morale's neck and blinked at him, dazed. One hand was clutched round her exposed breast. Her armour plate was abandoned on the floor. Her tunic was unfastened nearly to her waist. Jay took hold of him by the collar and hauled him off her. Paril struggled. Jay struck him neatly on the side of the jaw, and he tumbled backwards, off balance, thudding onto the floor. "Come on, Captain," said Jay briskly. "Pull yourself together." Paril rolled over into a half-sitting position, rubbing his jaw. "Morale," he murmured, with a slight edge of panic in his voice. She was lying where she had fallen from under him, motionless on the floor. Jay knelt over her and checked her breathing, which sounded low and shallow against his ear. He patted her cheek gently, but her head lolled loosely sideways. When he lifted an eyelid, he saw only white. It was clear that she was unconscious, and it was almost certainly an adverse effect of the glyn juice, but he knew nothing about treating people in this condition. Her symptoms seemed identical to those he would expect from a blow to the head. "What have I done to her?" said Perile, in a slurred groan. "Nothing as yet, fortunately. Now, we don't want to draw attention to this, Perile. Who is the healer here?" "Nagal." Jay straightened up and looked over at the roaring crowd of sword-bearers at the far end of the room. Mass attention was focused on whoever was making a fool of themselves in the circle. He fastened Marile's tunic up as quickly as he could, rolled her carefully onto her side with one arm propped under her body, and went in search of Nagal. He found the healer stretched out full length on the floor near the fire, dribbling juice into his open mouth from a goblet held at arm's length. It did not look promising. Jay was hesitating, wondering whether it was even worth attempting to speak to him, when he became aware that Dazil had appeared suddenly at his side. "Is there a problem, Commander?" "Yes, there is. Marile is unwell, and that, I'm told, is the healer." "Where is she?" Jay led her to where Perile was now sitting against the wall, his head slumped in his hands. Marile had not stirred. Dazil felt the pulse in her neck, pulled up her eyelid, then shook her shoulders and said her name in a low, firm voice. There was no response. "It's alcohol poisoning," she said. "She's been poisoned." "When fruit juice is left to ferment, there's a chemical reaction which creates a poison called alcohol. It affects the brain in unpredictable ways. In most people, it depresses motor functions. Some people hallucinate, and a fair number of people become disinhibited, dangerous, and temporarily psychotic. That's why it's illegal." "I'll call the hospital." "It's not necessary. There's nothing medics can do anyway. She'll recover on her own when the poison works its way out of her body. We just have to take her to somewhere quiet and get one of the servants to watch over her to make sure she doesn't choke. Help me lift her." "I think we should call for a proper doctor." "Corral won't have them in the castle, and anyway, it would cause problems. My mother trained me as a healer. I know how to deal with this." There was enough competence and authority in her manner to encourage Jay to believe her. Instead of helping her to lift Morale, he scooped the girl up in his arms. She was twice as heavy as he had expected, a sagging weight, and leaving Perile where he was to look after himself, followed Dazil as she led her away from the hall. She took him up 2 flights of stairs and along into the upper corridor where the sick rooms were, a part of the castle relatively unfamiliar to Jay. He had twice helped others to bring an injured man here for attention and rest, but he had not lingered. There was a treatment room at the far end of the passage, and small bedrooms leading off. Dazil opened the nearest door, and Jay was thankful to deposit Marile, as carefully as he could, onto the bed. Dazil arranged Marile's limbs in what Jay recognised as a recovery position, then pressed the call panel by the bed. "Nan was probably asleep," she said, "but she's the most experienced of the healer servants. She'll make sure no harm comes to her." They had not spoken since leaving the hall. After the clamour of the feast, the silence up here was profound, and her voice, in contrast, startling. He turned to look at her properly, and found her gazing at him steadily, with something like determination in her eyes. His mind weighed the circumstance of the soon-to-be-arriving servant against the ripeness of the moment, and then took the extra step that moved him into danger. If it were ever to go wrong, it would be in that second he came close enough to smell a woman's skin. She was still, her eyes open wide. Slowly, with the greatest care, he pressed his mouth against her cheek. The skin was soft and cool. His fingers found a soft point at the back of her neck, just where her hair met skin, and stroked there gently. She shivered as she now closed her eyes, and he felt a warm rush of breath, which she covered with a kiss. There was no resistance at all, not even the hesitation of inexperience. What had been stone and crystal flowed around his arms like water. He tasted her mouth, He found what softness he could under the hard leather. Then he let go all at once. Subliminally, he had registered the approaching footsteps. When an elderly servant stumped into the room, dressed in a night shift with a shawl thrown over it, they were 3 feet apart and outwardly composed. "This lady is not used to glyn juice and needs to rest," said Dazil. "You will watch over her and let me know immediately if there is any problem." The servant bowed deeply and took her place at the head of the bed. There was a chair there, but Jay had the feeling she was not going to sit down until they had left. Dazil had already turned to go, so he said, "Sorry about waking you up." She bowed even lower and looked terrified. Realizing that he was disconcerting her, Jay followed Dazil back out into the quiet coolness of the hospital wing corridor. They walked distinctly apart, slowly, in silence. "You're sure she'll be all right?" said Jay eventually. "She will feel extremely ill tomorrow, but as long as the servant watches her carefully, she won't suffer any lasting damage. The one great danger is choking. The poison acts as an irritant on the stomach, often causes vomiting, and in someone who is unconscious, as you probably know, that can be fatal." "Not a particularly glorious death. Perhaps I should stay with her instead." "No, Nan knows what to do." She paused and then she said, "You're curious."
"Am I?"
"Talking to the servant like that, as if it mattered that we'd woken her, as if it wasn't her duty and privilege to be there."
"I'm sure it is her duty and privilege, but courtesy and respect never go amiss. The serving castes are sentient beings. They have feelings like we do."
"Did your mother teach you that?"
"Yes, she did."
He stopped and turned to face her, searching for another signal. "We have to go back to the hall," she said, her tone suddenly low and direct. "Someone will remember us leaving together if we don't return. Later."
"Yes?"
"Caral will sleep soundly tonight." Jay was hesitating deliciously on the point of risking another kiss, out here in the corridor where anyone might theoretically come along, when distant shouts with an urgent tone and one piercing woman's scream made him draw back sharply. He hurried down the stairs towards the hall and burst into a scene of chaos. Sagat was standing on a table, his sword drawn, stabbing viciously at anyone who tried to approach him. Caral was roaring at him to disarm and come down, but keeping well back. As Jay came closer, he saw one of the servants face down and unmoving on the floor with a puddle of blood spreading from under his arm. He heard Dazil's intake of breath as she arrived behind him and saw the injured servant. She started to hurry towards him, but Sagat swung his sword wildly in her direction.
"Keep back! All of you! Get away from her!" yelled Caral.
And there was another scream as a white bolt of light seared a groove into the tabletop far wide of its target. Swiftly, Jay made his way to Caral and wrestled the gun from his hand. "Sorry, sir. You'll kill someone. Leave him to me." Caral tottered backwards. Jay turned the gun directly on Sagat and said, "Come on now. Drop the sword."
"Is that an order, Commander?"
"If you like. Drop the sword in front of you."
"Where do you get your courage from, Commander? A gun? Is that a sword-bearer's weapon?"
"In that it's effective, yes. Drop the sword, Sagat. You don't know what you're doing."
"I don't know what I'm doing. The brave, the great, the handsome Commander Javal knows what he's doing, though. Do you think I don't see into your soul, Javal? You say one thing, you mean another. You say one thing, you do another. You're no true sword-bearer."
Jay could feel a tight coldness closing round his chest, the closest sensation to fear he ever experienced. It was vitally important he stopped this fool talking right now, in the name of the Empress. He could even be a latent prophet, but he could not risk firing the gun and killing him. Decisive and ostentatious action was needed to distract Sagat and keep him quiet. He flung aside the gun, drew his own sword, and leapt onto the table. Sagat took an immediate and remarkably coordinated swing at him. Jay countered the move by striking the sword away, intending primarily to disarm him as quickly as possible without either of them losing their balance on the table. Sagat's grip on his weapon appeared firm, however, and he took another lightning plunge forward. The ferocity of the attack, which really meant to wound or kill, was unlike anything Jay had encountered before. He had been so sure of his advantage, sober against drunk, that he failed to defend himself by the split second that mattered, and he felt a clean slice of pain as the edge of Sagat's sword caught his body. Suddenly less concerned about keeping him intact, Jay slammed his fist into Sagat's mouth, kicked his shin from under him, and sent his sword clattering onto the floor. He pinned him to the tabletop with one foot on his chest, pressing the point of his sword to his throat. Sagat's head had lolled sideways, his eyes half closed. Carefully, just in case Sagat was feigning unconsciousness, Jay took his sword away and used it to gesture to the nearest group of sword-bearers who were standing upright. "You men, help me to secure him. Take him to the cells and make sure he's guarded all night." Sagat was hauled off the table and stumbled away by 4 men, his arms secured behind his back. Jay retrieved Corral's gun from where he had tossed it and returned it to his owner with a deep bow. "Good work, Commander," said Corral gruffly. He was uncoordinated but still mentally perceptive. "You're bleeding. Get it seen to. Dazil, patch him up." Jay glanced down at where Sagat's sword had cut a neat slash in the fabric of his tunic, just below his arm where the leather shielding did not protect him. He could feel blood trickling down underneath the breastplate. "You had better accompany us to the sick rooms, Commander," said Dazil quietly. She was kneeling by the injured servant, who was stirring. It was good to be acting under orders. Alone in the curiously bright artificial light of the treatment room, once the servant had been treated, for what had fortunately turned out to be a superficial slash on the upper arm, it was a blow to the head which had knocked him out, Dazil would not allow him to remove his own breastplate or tunic. With her eyes downcast and modest, she unfastened the catches. "You mustn't move your arm unnecessarily, in case there's muscle damage." "It's just a nick." "Which one of us is the healer?" "You, apparently." "This isn't how I imagined it would be." "Keep still." She had opened up the tunic now, and was cleaning the blood away with a pad of something extraordinarily cold. "It's just a shallow flesh wound. A bandage should knit it together in 24 hours. Hold still while I put on some of this." Some of this was a vicious antiseptic which made him wince, followed by a bandage tape which imparted an immediate buzzing, burning sensation as whatever it had in it started work on bonding the flesh together. Her fingers were light and cool on his bare skin. He waited until she had finished securing the bandage, then, before she took her hand away, caught one and pressed it firmly against his chest. For the first time since they had been alone again, she raised her eyes to his. "Commander," she said evenly, "you've been injured. I would recommend that you go to bed immediately and rest to help the wound heal. I should make sure that my husband also gets safely to bed. It is my duty, however, to check on your progress later." She turned away and tidied the medical instruments and materials as he pulled on his tunic and breastplate, and left her with a full, sweeping bow. The door hummed. It was a tiny noise, but Jay rolled over immediately as if it were a fire alarm and stared at the silhouette in the open crack. He had been lying awake in a trance of anticipation, holding rational thought carefully just out of reach. He did not want to think about the danger, or dwell on the fact that of all the women on Caraville, this was the one he should leave alone. As the door slid shut, she became a shadow in the moonlight. He sat up and pressed his hand over the bedside light, casting a very faint glow over the room. She was still fully dressed, though it was the deepest quarter of the night, and she appeared to be hesitating as she stood against the door. He swung off the bed and went close to her. She was ice, not crystal, and he could melt her. As I promised, Commander, I've come to see how you are. Her voice was low and steady. I think I'll survive the night, but perhaps you'd better take a closer look. He stood absolutely still, close enough for her to feel his heat, but not reaching out to her. Since she was here under her own volition, at a time of her choosing, he was suddenly determined to make her touch him first, and he could feel his heart thudding with excitement at the novelty. It was a very long time indeed since a woman had come to him. After a few moments of immobile silence, she unfastened the catch on the shoulder of his night shift and pulled it gently open to expose the site of the wound. She stopped and let her hand fall away, and her eyes flicked up to meet his. He saw fear in her expression, mingled, again, with determination. It was no longer a good idea to allow her time to think or to talk. Abandoning all delicacy, he grabbed hold of her and kissed every patch of bare skin he could find. Soon, it was all of her. You've done this before, haven't you? Yes, of course. How could you think otherwise? How often? I don't remember. She exhaled slightly, not quite a sigh. How have you managed it? I'm careful. The other women, who were they? I can't tell you that. I don't mean their names. I mean, what kind of women were they? Were they servants? Some, yes. Not all. She was gazing at the ceiling, detached from him. Women were inclined to be interrogative, and he had noticed that they got petulant when he resisted their probing. There was only one really effective way to deflect the problem, even though he was now sleepy and irritated. There was no sensation to compare with the silken warmth of a woman's body. Just to hold it all against him was worth the danger, even with the hungry fire doused. As he kissed her to stop her talking, desire stirred again, almost painfully. He recognized the beginning of that glorious state of intoxication when senses were sharpened, and nothing more than a look or a brush of her fingers would set the air ablaze. It certainly did not always happen, but while it lasted, it was exhilarating. And she would almost certainly feel it too, if not now, then soon. In the white heat of his own passion, he could not accurately remember whether she had enjoyed the first time. Now he held back and made sure that she did. It was a particular kind of satisfaction to make the cool and dignified lady of Caraville cry and thrash, helpless against a relentless assault. Afterwards, there were no more questions. He fell into a heavy sleep with her curled up in his arms. And when he awoke, in bright daylight, she had gone. He dealt with Sagat first. The cells were down in the deepest part of the castle, buried into the hillside. They were more commonly used to incarcerate wrongdoers from the town and its environs while they were awaiting trial, and there was a detachment of the army dedicated to guarding and handling prisoners. The captain of the guard led him down to the holding cell, where Sagat was slumped on a wooden bench, his arm over his eyes. He reacted to Jay's arrival by rolling over and turning his face to the wall. Lord Corral has instructed me to release you, said Jay, stonily. I have to say I'm reluctant to do that. The captain bowed and left them alone. Sagat did not respond. Since it was an order, I'm bound to obey. However, listen to this, Sagat. If you drink Glyn juice once more while I'm commander of Caraville, I will lodge an official report with General Neveth. Do you understand? To Jay's intense annoyance, Sagat still said nothing. He decided not to force a response, but said to the captain, who was lurking respectfully in the corridor just outside, "Set him free, and tell him he's due to take the cadet class in half an hour." Next, he sought out Peril. Peril had not appeared at breakfast, but was in the armoury alone, polishing weapons. It was a servant's job, unnecessary. When he became aware of Jay's presence, he clattered the sword aside and stood to attention, his head bowed and his expression stricken. "In Lon's name, Captain, at ease." Peril slumped, though anyone less at ease would be harder to imagine. There was a noticeable bruise along the line of his jaw where Jay's blow had landed. Deliberately, Jay sat on the bench opposite. "Sir," Peril stammered, "I want you to know how deeply sorry I am for the shameful way I behaved last night, and for failing to protect Morale. I was coming to see you. I meant to. I feel ashamed you had to find me first. I've already spoken to Morale. We're going to break off our betrothal." "Come on now. That's entirely unnecessary." "I behaved with gross dishonour." "Did she put up a fight?" "No, but she'd drunk so much Glyn juice she didn't know what she was doing. But I did. It's never had very much of an effect on me, sir. You notice that? Some people fall over. Some go almost mad. Some don't change much. I could still think straight, and I knew what I was doing was wrong. I just couldn't help myself. She deserves so much better than that. What if it happened again? What if you hadn't been there? How can I risk bringing that kind of shame onto her? If we dissolve our engagement, she can find someone else, someone worthy of her." "Captain, I'm going to give you an order, and I expect you to obey immediately and without question." "Yes, sir." "Go back to wherever you left Morale and tell her that the wedding will be on the day of the spring solstice, by order of Commander Cheval. Get all the preparations done between now and then, however much time you have to spend on them. Go on now." Peril, who had not sat down during this interview, looked for a moment as if he was going to disobey and question the order. Instead, he bowed briskly and half ran on his way out of the armoury. Jay leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment, disorientated. It was one of those occasional moments of acute awareness, when he knew he was standing outside the world and could feel how cold it was.